The empire he had once built on stone, glass, and unyielding schedules now breathed through softer walls, through laughter echoing in the kitchen, through drawings taped imperfectly on corners of marble that architects had once polished into cold perfection. He sat in that room where silence used to be his crown, and realized silence no longer ruled him. It had been dethroned by the rhythm of Isabella's little feet running across the floorboards, by the weight of Rose's quiet smile when she thought he wasn't watching, by Mary's patient pouring of tea as though each cup carried an unspoken benediction. The city outside glittered with ambitions, towers reaching higher than his once had, and he did not envy them. His hands, once restless for contracts, signatures, power, now lingered on the fabric of Isabella's toy, on the rim of his teacup, on Rose's shoulder when she passed by. He had learned the most difficult arithmetic, subtracting the unnecessary and multiplying what remained. That night, after Isabella had been carried off to her room with Clara still under her arm, he stood on the terrace. The skyline stretched wide, jeweled and indifferent, but for the first time it did not dwarf him. He was not smaller than the city, nor larger. He was exactly himself, a man whose breath came easier, whose steps were steadier, whose heart beat not for boardrooms or headlines, but for the simple fact of being here. Rose joined him quietly, her shawl pulled close, her presence warm even in the cool air. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood there together, two shadows leaning into one another, gazing over a city that once demanded everything and now asked nothing. Mary's voice called softly from inside, reminding them the tea was cooling. Rose gave a faint laugh, and they turned back toward the glow of lamps and quiet rooms, walking together unhurried. It was in those steps, in the pause before crossing the threshold back into his home, that James understood. Wealth was not the empire he had once built, but the life he could now hold without fear of losing it. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm almost unfamiliar to him. There were no dramatic board meetings, no sharp arguments echoing across conference rooms, no journalists waiting outside glass doors. Instead, there was the tender chaos of a household that breathed in its own pace. He woke to the sound of Isabella's voice drifting through the halls, singing to her stuffed animals in a language only she understood. He lingered in the kitchen, where Mary's hands moved with steady grace, brewing tea the way she always had, each movement an act of constancy that reminded him not all foundations were made of steel. Rose, too, moved differently now. He watched her sometimes when she thought no one was looking, her hands resting on the back of a chair, her eyes tracing the horizon through the windows, her expression carrying something lighter than before. She had been his mirror through the storm, and now she was the proof that healing was not a solitary pursuit. It was a shared effort, stitched into daily moments of quiet care, of ordinary presence that shimmered like treasure once overlooked. James had once measured his worth by the speed at which he could sign away his time. Now he measured it by the slowness of his evenings. Each dinner was not just food, but ritual. Each shared silence was not emptiness, but depth. And yet, beneath it all, a certain fragility lingered. He could feel it in the way Rose's eyes sometimes searched his face, as though reassuring herself he was still here, still steady. He could sense it in Isabella's small, innocent demands for promises. "You'll be here tomorrow?" Promises he gave not to fate, not to fortune, but to himself. For he had come to understand that love was not infinite. It required deliberate tending, as disciplined as any empire he had once built. Spring unfurled in the city like a silk ribbon. Rain softened the corners of hard streets. Trees shook out their blossoms, and the air carried with it the promise of renewal. James found himself walking more often, through gardens, along the quieter streets near the river, his pace unhurried. He discovered the city he had lived in for years, but never truly seen. The benches he had never sat on. The bakeries whose windows fogged with warmth and scent. The small bookstores tucked between towers where dust motes floated in golden air. Sometimes Isabella walked with him, her hand wrapped firmly in his, her questions tumbling out like pearls. She asked why birds never got tired of flying, why the river never stopped moving, why people looked sad even when the sun was shining. He answered as best he could, his words carrying not the sharpness of certainty but the softness of wonder. He realized that once, he might have hurried her along, brushed off her questions in the name of efficiency. Now, Her questions became anchors that slowed him, kept him tethered to the world that existed outside of balance sheets and boardrooms. One evening, a letter arrived. Heavy cream paper, the kind that still held weight and dignity in a digital age. It came from the office, an invitation to a gala in his honor. The board wanted to celebrate his return, to parade him once again before the world as a figurehead of resilience, of triumph over weakness. James held the envelope at the table, the edges pressing into his fingers. Rose watched him, her expression unreadable, though her hand paused halfway through folding a napkin. Isabella leaned forward, eyes curious, as though she could sense the importance hidden in the paper. He opened it, read it, and folded it back slowly. A younger version of himself would have already called the tailor, would have relished the spotlight, the applause, the cameras flashing against polished marble. But now the thought felt hollow, like an echo in an empty hall. "Will you go?" Rose asked quietly. He looked at her, then at Isabella, who had already lost interest and returned to her toy. He set the envelope aside. "No," he said, and the word carried no regret. "I already have what they want to celebrate. I don't need them to tell me I'm alive. I can feel it here." He touched his chest, where the rhythm of his heart still surprised him sometimes. Rose's shoulders softened, her breath releasing something she hadn't even realized she was holding. Mary, who had been carrying in a tray of fruit, gave the smallest of nods, as though affirming the choice with quiet approval. The nights grew warmer. Windows were left open, and the house filled with the scent of lilacs carried on the breeze. James began writing again, not contracts or directives, but thoughts. He filled notebooks with fragments of memory, with gratitude, with lines of poetry he never thought he would understand, let alone compose. He wrote letters to Isabella, letters to Rose, even one to Mary that he tucked into the kitchen drawer where she would someday find it. He wanted to leave behind not just wealth, not just buildings with his name etched in stone, but words, his words, that carried the truth of who he had become. One night, Rose found him at his desk, pen still in hand, his head bent over a half-finished page. She touched his shoulder lightly, and he looked up, startled but not guilty. There was no secrecy here, only the intimacy of being fully seen. "What are you writing?" she asked softly. "Something she can read when she's older," he said, nodding toward Isabella's room. "Something she can keep when I can't be here." Rose leaned down and kissed his temple. "You're here now," she whispered. And in that moment, he realized, presence was the only legacy worth building. The chapter closes with James lying awake in the hush of night, Rose's steady breathing beside him, the city humming faintly beyond the glass. He thought of the gala he had refused, the empire that no longer held him, the fragile yet profound wealth he had claimed instead. He turned on his side, pressed a hand gently over Rose's, and closed his eyes to the rhythm of a heart that no longer raced for power but for love. The night carried him into sleep with a softness he had not known in years. Gone were the jagged edges of restless dreams, the frantic calculations of gain and loss, the silent wars that had once fought behind his eyelids. Instead, he dreamed of water, clear, endless water, shimmering with sunlight that bent and broke into prisms. Isabella's laughter drifted across the waves, Rose's voice hummed low like a hymn, and Mary's presence was the quiet shore that never receded. He woke before dawn, the images still clinging like silk to his mind, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to linger in bed, tracing the pale light crawling across the ceiling. Rose stirred beside him, her breathing deep and even. He watched her for a long while, the quiet miracle of her closeness never lost on him. The lines at the corners of her eyes spoke of years both gentle and hard, years they had lived together, though not always in peace. He remembered how many times she had waited alone while he buried himself in work. How many times she had smiled for Isabella when her own heart was heavy. How many times she had endured his distance. Now, with her hair spilling across the pillow, her hand resting in his as if it had always belonged there, he knew that the greatest luxury he could ever afford was to give her his undivided presence. The morning unfolded with its own quiet majesty. Isabella padded into the room, hair tangled, clutching Clara. She climbed onto the bed and curled herself against his side without a word. The three of them lay there, framed by the soft light of dawn, a portrait of the empire he had rebuilt, not in steel and glass, but in flesh and devotion. Later that morning, James found himself in the garden. The city hummed beyond the walls, impatient and urgent as ever, but here the air was still. Dew clung to the grass, glistening like gemstones scattered carelessly by the night. He sat on the stone bench, his cane beside him though he rarely needed it now, and breathed deeply. For years he had possessed everything yet felt nothing. Now he possessed little and felt everything. Mary joined him, carrying a tray with tea. She placed it down without ceremony, her movements as steady as the seasons. "You're up early," she remarked, her tone carrying no judgment, only observation. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, though his voice held no weariness. "Or perhaps I slept too well." Mary's lips curved into the smallest smile. "That's a good problem to have." They sat in silence, the kind of silence that comforted rather than suffocated. James realized he no longer feared silence when it was shared with those who mattered. It was no longer an emperor over him, but a companion. The weeks that followed became a tapestry of moments James once would have dismissed as trivial. Isabella's school projects spread across the dining table. Rose's books stacked near the armchair she favored. The scent of Mary's cooking drifting through the hallways. Evenings filled with board games and laughter that echoed against walls that had once absorbed only the metallic echoes of loneliness. But life, James knew, had a way of testing the fortresses we built, even the gentle ones. It began with a letter. Another invitation, this time not to a gala, but to return to the board in some honorary capacity. The words were polite, the offer generous. They wanted his name, his presence, his weight to lend them credibility. He read the letter slowly, the way one examines a familiar wound, and set it down. Rose found him staring at it, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "The world doesn't forgive absence. It only circles back, trying to pull you in again. Will you answer?" He thought of it long into the night. Not with the old hunger, but with the careful attention of a man who understood the stakes were no longer financial but spiritual. To return would mean sacrificing the fragile rhythm he had built. To decline would mean closing a door forever. In the end, his choice was clear. One evening, he gathered Rose, Isabella, and Mary in the living room. The lamps glowed with golden light, casting soft halos across the walls. Isabella sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing absent-mindedly. Rose perched on the arm of the chair, her eyes watchful. Mary folded her hands in her lap, steady as always. "I've been asked to return," James said simply. Rose's lips pressed together, her silence holding both fear and hope. Isabella looked up, curious but uncomprehending. Mary raised her eyebrows, slightly waiting. "I've decided," James continued, "that I won't." The words settled like petals falling into water. Rose exhaled slowly, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. Mary gave a single nod, approval in the small tilt of her head. Isabella, sensing the gravity but not the details, climbed into his lap and pressed her face against his chest. "You'll be here then," she whispered. "I'll be here," he answered, and this time it was not just a promise, but a vow carved into the very marrow of his being. Spring ripened into summer. The city grew loud, restless with festivals and fireflies. James took Isabella to the aquarium more often, their secret kingdom of light and water. Together they pressed their faces to the glass, watching the fish swirl in endless motion. "Do you think they ever get tired of swimming?" Isabella asked one afternoon. "Maybe," James said. "But even if they do, they don't stop. They just keep moving, because that's their way of being alive." Isabella considered this seriously. "Then I'll swim forever too." He laughed, his heart swelling at her certainty. Rose, standing nearby, caught his gaze and held it. Between them passed a quiet recognition that life, fragile as it was, had returned to them, shimmering and stubborn as the fish behind the glass. One evening, after Isabella had fallen asleep, James and Rose lingered in the living room. The night was warm, the windows open, the city's heartbeat faint but steady beyond. "You gave them your answer," Rose said, breaking the silence. "I did," he replied. "And for the first time, I don't feel loss. I feel freedom." Rose moved closer, her hand resting on his. "Freedom isn't something you buy. It's something you choose." He turned to her, his eyes softer than she had ever known them. Then I choose you. I choose this. Every time. Rose's breath caught, her composure breaking for just a moment. She leaned into him, their foreheads touching, the space between them charged with all the words they didn't need to say. For the man who once measured time in contracts and signatures, the minutes of that evening stretched endlessly, each one a jewel he would never trade. The chapter closes with James standing once again in the hallway before the framed drawing Isabella had once given him. His fingers brushed the glass lightly. 4 figures, hand in hand. He no longer saw it as a child's sketch. He saw it as a map, a guide to truth. He whispered into the quiet, "This is my empire." And with those words, he turned back toward the glow of the living room, where Rose waited, where Isabella dreamed, where Mary kept watch. "This is my empire." With those words, James turned back toward the glow of the living room, where Rose waited, where Isabella dreamed, where Mary kept watch. The air inside was warm, perfumed with chamomile and the faint trace of lilac that drifted through the open windows. The city pulsed beyond, but within these walls, time slowed, bent, and wrapped itself around the 3 women who had become the architecture of his survival. Rose sat with her book open but unread, her gaze lifting when he entered. A question lingered in her eyes. Not spoken, not needed. "Are you still here? Still with us?" He answered with the gentlest of nods, crossing the room to sit beside her. Her hand found his without ceremony, their fingers weaving together in the way roots entwine beneath soil, hidden, silent, but unshakable. Mary passed quietly behind them, carrying away the empty cups from earlier. She did not intrude, but James felt the weight of her presence nonetheless. She was the unspoken rhythm of his home, the constant note that made every other sound harmonious. And Isabella, in her room just beyond the hallway, dreamed her small but mighty dreams, her breath rising and falling like the tide. For James, the empire had finally taken shape. Not in skyscrapers, not in headlines, not in the kind of applause that fades like smoke, but in this room, this moment, this fragile permanence of belonging. The following morning arrived with a sun brighter than usual, as though the world itself conspired to reflect the clarity he now carried in his chest. He rose early, moving quietly through the house. His footsteps no longer echoed with loneliness, they moved with purpose, a cadence softened by love. He paused in the kitchen where Mary was already at work, slicing fruit with her usual efficiency. "You never sleep," he teased gently, leaning on the doorway. Mary glanced up, her expression calm, her eyes amused. "And you never used to notice." The word struck him, not as an accusation but as a truth he had ignored for too long. He nodded, acknowledging it. "I notice now," he said, his tone sincere. She gave a small smile, one that said more than words ever could, and returned to her work. At breakfast, Isabella was a whirlwind of chatter, her plate barely touched as she described a dream in which the clownfish at the aquarium had learned to juggle seashells. Rose listened with amused patience, correcting her gently when she exaggerated, though her smile betrayed her indulgence. James, however, simply listened, laughing when Isabella laughed, allowing her imagination to weave itself freely. For once, he didn't think about time. He didn't think about schedules. He didn't think about the empire he had left behind. He thought only of the empire before him, the child's joy, the woman's quiet strength, the caregiver's steady presence. After breakfast, he walked Isabella to school. The city bustled around them, impatient and hurried, but James felt no need to match its tempo. Isabella held his hand tightly, her steps skipping every few moments, as though the ground itself were too eager to hold her. At the school gates, she paused, looking up at him with that same seriousness that often startled him. "You'll be here when I come back?" He crouched, smoothing a strand of hair from her face. "Always," he said. She studied him for a moment, then nodded with a confidence that felt like faith. "Okay," she whispered, before running off to join her classmates. He watched her go, the morning sun catching her hair, until she disappeared into the building. For the first time in years, leaving someone behind did not fill him with dread. It filled him with purpose. The day unfolded quietly. James spent the morning in the garden, reading one of the books Rose had left near his chair. He had once devoured words only for strategy, for power, for advantage. Now he read them for beauty, for reflection, for the sheer joy of learning something without the intention of using it. Rose joined him later, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat beside him, not interrupting his reading, simply existing near him. That was her gift. She did not demand his attention. She invited it. And he gave it freely. "You're different," she murmured after a long silence. He lowered the book, meeting her gaze. "I hope so." Her eyes softened. "Not just different, lighter. As though you've put something down." He nodded. "I suppose I have. The weight of being untouchable. The illusion of immortality." Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. "And what do you carry now?" He placed the book aside, sliding his arm around her. "You. Her. Us." The words were not grand, not poetic, but they were true. And in their truth lay a kind of poetry grander than any verse. That evening, as twilight draped the city in violet and gold, James found himself walking the long hallway again. His bare feet touched the marble, cool and familiar. He paused before the framed drawing once more. 4 figures, hand in hand. It had always been Isabella's vision of family, drawn with the innocence of a child. But now James saw it as prophecy. She had drawn not what was, but what could be. What should be. What was now. He pressed his palm against the glass, not to reach through it, but to affirm it. Behind him, Rose's voice called softly, "Come back. The tea is ready." He turned, and for the first time he did not feel torn between the hallway and the room beyond. He belonged to both, the past that had wounded him and the present that healed him. Summer deepened. The days grew long, drenched in heat, the air heavy with jasmine and dust. James found himself spending more time outdoors, walking by the river with Rose, sometimes with Isabella skipping ahead. The water shimmered, restless and eternal, reflecting the city's glitter and its shadows. One evening, as the 3 of them stood at the riverbank, Isabella pointed at the water. "Does it ever stop moving?" she asked. "No," James said, his voice thoughtful. "It carries everything. Joy, sorrow, memories, promises. It moves because life moves." Rose slipped her hand into his. "Like us," she whispered. James nodded. "Like us." But with summer also came reminders. Letters continued to arrive, more insistent now. Invitations to speak, to lead, to return. The empire he had abandoned did not forget him easily. Each envelope carried the weight of a life he no longer lived. One afternoon, Mary placed another letter on his desk. He stared at it for a long while, then pushed it aside. "Not today," he murmured. Mary, wise as always, said nothing. She simply removed the letter later, tucking it into a drawer where forgotten things lived. James understood then. Some battles are not fought with swords or signatures, but with silence. The chapter closes on a golden evening. James sits on the terrace, Isabella curled in his lap, Rose leaning against his side, Mary watching from the doorway. The city glimmers, impatient and restless, but within this terrace, time folds gently around them. James looks at them all, his voice low, certain. "This," he says, "is enough." And for the first time in his life, he knows the words are true. The nights grew longer, yet they carried no weight. Where once silence pressed down on James like a crown of iron, now it softened around him like velvet. The days unfolded with rhythm, no longer ruled by urgency but by presence, each hour measured in something more precious in power. He had promised Isabella that he would be there, and for the first time in his life, a promise felt lighter than breath because it was real. Morning came wrapped in the gentle gold of early spring. The curtains stirred with a mild breeze, carrying with it the scent of blossoms from the streets below. James opened his eyes slowly, not with the dread of another day to conquer, but with gratitude that another day had arrived. The air was alive with subtle sounds, distant laughter, the faint hum of the aquarium, and Rosa's soft steps across the room as she drew the curtains wider. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and unhurried. He studied her face for a moment, framed by light, and wondered if he had ever truly looked at her before this season of fragility. He had been surrounded by luxury for so long, yet only now did he realize that the greatest luxury was time spent in stillness beside her. Isabella's laugh rang from the hallway. James rose, pulling his robe around him, and stepped out into the corridor. The marble, cool beneath his bare feet, seemed less like stone and more like memory. His eyes lingered on the framed drawing again, the four figures hand in hand. The smile of the tall man in the suit no longer seemed impossible, it seemed inevitable, as though the child's hand had known what the man's heart had not. He touched the glass gently, then walked toward the sound of his daughter. In the kitchen, the morning glowed with warmth. Isabella sat at the counter, a stethoscope slung around her neck, tapping it against an orange as though diagnosing its secrets. Mary busied herself at the stove, her hand steady as always, her presence as grounding as stone. Rose poured milk into a small glass, her eyes lifting to him with quiet acknowledgement. "Papa!" Isabella cried, abandoning her fruit patient and running into his arms. Her hair smelled faintly of lavender soap, her laughter bubbling against his chest. "Good morning, little doctor," James whispered, kneeling to meet her gaze. She pressed the toy stethoscope against his heart, her face intent with concentration. "Still louder," she declared, "like the fish when they swim fast." His laughter filled the room, warm and unguarded. Rose shook her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile, as if she were storing the sound away with the rest of her hidden treasures. They ate together, bread, fruit, eggs Mary insisted were not quite right, but were perfect nonetheless. Once, James would have dined alone with reports spread across a table, breakfast nothing more than fuel for the day ahead. Now the clatter of Isabella's spoon, Rose's quiet humming, Mary's fussing over the tea, it was wealth in its truest form. Afterward, Isabella tugged at his hand and pulled him toward the aquarium. The great tank shimmered, alive with color. She pressed her face to the glass, her small fingers splayed as though reaching into another world. "They still need to learn their trick," she said, her voice filled with determination. James stood beside her, watching the dance of light and water, and felt something stir deep in his chest, a sense that he was no longer watching life from behind glass but standing fully within it. The days found a new rhythm. He worked less, stayed home more. His presence at the office was no longer demanded, it was symbolic. The empire he had built could run without him, something he had once feared but now welcomed. When he did attend meetings, he listened more, spoke less. The hunger for dominance had left him. In its place was something gentler, more enduring, a desire to understand, to guide without crushing. Evenings became a sanctuary. Rose by the window with a book, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Mary preparing tea, her every gesture slow and certain. Isabella dancing through the halls, her toy stethoscope dangling, her laughter ringing like bells. James sat among them, his breath steady, his heart calm. Wealth had changed its shape. It was no longer the cold glitter of accounts and towers, but the warmth of these rooms, filled with voices that mattered. One evening, as twilight poured like ink across the city, Rose set her book aside. Her eyes, steady and luminous, sought his. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, unguarded. "Regret what?" "The years you gave away. The empire you built. The silence you chose." James let the question linger. The man he once was would have defended every choice, recited every figure, named every victory. But now he only shook his head. "I regret the moments I didn't spend here," he said softly. "I regret the laughter I missed, the voices I didn't hear. I don't regret the empire. I regret the silences." Rose reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "And now I choose differently." The city shifted into spring. James walked more, his step steady, his cane forgotten. He strolled with Rose through crowded markets, where vendors called out with bright voices, through gardens where blossoms spilled across pathways, through streets where children's laughter rose into the dusk. Isabella skipped beside them, clutching a balloon he had bought her, its red glow catching the sun. Once he had measured wealth in towers. Now he measured it in steps taken hand in hand. They hosted dinners, not the glittering galas of old, but warm gatherings with colleagues who had become friends, neighbors who had once been strangers. The table glowed with flowers and simple dishes. Laughter filled the air like a rare vintage. James no longer sat as emperor at the head of the table, but as a man, listening, smiling, belonging. When the guests had gone, when the house was quiet again, he walked the hall one more time. He paused before the framed drawing, tracing its lines with his gaze. 4 figures hand in hand, a smile that had once seemed unreachable. He realized it was no longer a vision of what could be, It was a mirror of what was. He returned to the living room. Isabella was already asleep, her toy clutched against her chest. Rose folded a blanket with unhurried grace. Mary turned off a lamp, her face serene in the glow. James stood there a long moment, watching them, before stepping fully into the room. He was no longer the emperor of silence. He was a man of presence, a man who had found his wealth, not in what he had conquered, but in what he had chosen to keep. And as he lowered himself onto the sofa, Rose's hand brushed his. Isabella's soft breath filled the room, and the aquarium hummed like a heartbeat. Tomorrow no longer felt fragile. It was here. It was certain. He was here, and this time he would remain. The season deepened into full spring, a time when the city seemed to breathe again after months of holding itself against the cold. The skyline shimmered brighter, softened by warmth, and every street seemed alive with color. Blossoms pressed against windowsills, children's laughter skipped along the avenues, and even the river gleamed as if it too had found a new rhythm. For James, the city was no longer a battlefield, no longer a monument to victories won and empires defended. It was a living backdrop to something far rarer, his own rebirth. He had become a student of ordinary moments. Each day carried lessons. The sound of Isabella's laughter at breakfast, the way Rose leaned into him when they walked through crowded markets, the quiet ritual of Mary setting tea at dusk. His heart, once measured in contracts and conquests, now pulsed with the softer arithmetic of love, gratitude, and presence. He no longer fought time as an enemy, he received it as a guest. Every hour a gift to be held, not hoarded. The aquarium had grown into their sanctuary. Once a symbol of his grandeur, now it was a stage for Isabella's imagination. She pressed her nose to the glass, whispering instructions to the fish, as though they were her pupils, certain that if she believed hard enough, they would learn her tricks. James watched her with wonder, feeling as though the fish reflected his own transformation, creatures once trapped in silence, now alive with color and motion. "Papa," Isabella said one afternoon, her voice decisive, "today they learned to swim in a circle. A perfect circle. You watch." She tapped the glass with her finger, eyes gleaming. James leaned closer, his hand brushing hers. "And if they do, then they're happy," she said simply. "Fish only make circles when they're happy." He smiled, touched by the purity of her truth. He thought of his own circles, the endless loops of power and ambition that had once defined him. Those circles had not been happiness, they had been cages. But these, the laughter, the fish, the simple days, they were circles of joy, closing around him not as prison bars but as embraces. Evenings took on their own kind of magic. Rose would read aloud in the living room, her voice steady, carrying words through the air like music. Isabella would curl against him with Clara tucked under her arm, her small fingers reaching up to trace the line of his jaw as though checking he was still there. Mary poured chamomile with her quiet grace, her every movement deliberate, unchanging, a kind of anchor in their shifting world. James listened to them all, not with the distracted half-presence of the man he once was, but with the full attention of someone who had learned how rare such evenings were. One night, when the lamps cast a honeyed glow and the aquarium's light shimmered faintly against the walls, Rose lowered her book and looked at him. Her expression carried both softness and gravity. "James," she said quietly, "you've changed." He tilted his head. "For better or worse?" "For real," she answered. "I used to think I'd lost you to the silence, that you had buried yourself so deeply in that empire that nothing could bring you back. But here you are, not as emperor, not as patient, as yourself." He held her gaze for a long time, the air between them rich with words unspoken. Then he reached across the small space, his fingers brushing hers. "And if I tell you," he said slowly, "that I don't miss who I was?" Her lips curved faintly. "Then I will tell you that I don't either." Silence followed, but it was no longer the heavy kind. It was alive, vibrant, humming with understanding. Spring turned to early summer. Days lengthened, spilling light late into the evenings. James found himself savoring each one with deliberate care. He walked through gardens, feeling the warmth on his skin, his steps strong where once they had faltered. He laughed more, deeply without shame. He even began to work with Isabella on her aquarium projects, sketching diagrams with her at the kitchen table as though fish tricks were as vital as stock reports. The empire no longer called to him as it once had. When he entered the office, people noticed the difference. His presence was not an iron weight pressing the room into silence, but a steady light guiding it forward. He asked questions. He listened. He allowed others to lead. Colleagues who had once feared him now respected him differently, warmly, openly, as if recognizing that the emperor had become a man. But at home, that was where his heart lived. One afternoon, Isabella came running in from the terrace, her cheeks flushed with sun, her balloon trailing behind her. "Papa!" she shouted breathlessly. "The sky is pink and orange and purple all at once. You have to see." He followed her outside, Rose by his side. Together, they stood as the horizon glowed with colors more vivid than any painting in his collection. Isabella clutched his hand tightly, her eyes wide. "It looks like magic," she whispered. James looked at her, then at Rose, then at the sky. "It is magic," he said softly, "and we are part of it." That night, as Isabella slept, Rose curled against him on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder. The aquarium glowed faintly, the city lights stretched beyond the terrace, and Mary hummed in the kitchen. James closed his eyes and let it wash over him, the sounds, the warmth, the unshakable knowledge that life had shifted. He was no longer surviving time. He was inhabiting it. And in that quiet, luxurious room, with love woven into every detail, he finally understood. Wealth had never been the empire he built. Wealth was here, in the circle of arms around him, in the steady rhythm of his heart, in the laughter of his child and the gaze of the woman beside him. The emperor of silence was gone. James was home, and for the first time in his life, he was certain he would never leave.